Carter's mornings began before sunrise, when the street lamps still dripped gold onto the cobbles outside Carter's corner shop. She measured the day in simple rituals, counting change into the till, sweeping in quiet strokes while her mother brewed tea, arranging bread loaves so they looked abundant even on thin days. "Presentation matters, Liz," Helena would murmur, tapping the glass. "People buy hope as much as bread." Elizabeth smiled and took mental notes, careful with every coin, every label, every list. Her father, George, tottered in with yesterday's newspaper tucked under his arm, pretending it was still relevant news. "Manchester's weather report," he declared, tipping it against his brow. "Rain with a chance of rain," Elizabeth laughed. She liked the predictability of this world, the bell above the door, the neighborhood children with jam-stained cheeks, the ledger where profits were small but honest. It was not glamorous, not loud, but it was theirs. On slower mornings, George taught her the shop's unspoken ethics. "If Mrs. Doyle is short, add the rest and write later," he'd say, circling a neat mark in the margin. "Dignity first." Helena added the softer lessons. "Nobody wants to feel examined when they're counting coins," she whispered. "Eyes up, smile warm." Elizabeth learned to look at people, not pockets. She wasn't extraordinary. She was steady. She studied by lamplight after closing, her textbooks mottled with flower fingerprints and tea stains. "You'll make something bright of yourself," Helena promised, brushing crumb dust from her shoulders. "Brighter than these lamps." Elizabeth tucked the words in her chest like a small, warm stone. Her life, though ordinary, felt like a patient seed that believed in the rain. She met Michael Hayes in the university library, the first week of term, when the rain pressed its tired face against the tall windows. He was the kind of boy who seemed to arrive with spotlight and soundtrack, pressed shirt, careless smile, a watch that whispered old money. Elizabeth had stacked econometrics and lending principles in a wobbly tower, trying to pretend the scholarship letter in her bag didn't terrify her. "You're going to topple Manchester with that," Michael said lightly, steadying her books with one long-fingered hand. "Michael," he added, offering a grin that made introductions sound like favors. "Elizabeth," she replied, smoothing her cardigan, feeling suddenly aware of its pilled elbows and practical buttons. He sat across from her and began to ask questions that felt like attention rather than interrogation. Their first conversation slid into a second, then lingered past closing time. "What do you want, really?" Michael asked as the librarian snapped lights. Elizabeth stared at the rain, thinking of ledgers and lamplight and Helena's soft rules. "To understand money without worshipping it," she said. "To protect people from being humiliated by it." He tilted his head. "I want to build an empire," he confessed, not a hint of irony. "Tall glass, my name glimmering above the city." He said it like a vow. She laughed quietly, half dazzled, half wary, and didn't notice she had begun to tilt toward his son. Before they parted, he walked her to the bus stop, umbrella tilted toward her more than himself. "I'll find you tomorrow," he promised. The rain oddly felt like blessing. They began to share a table, hers crowded with highlighters and homemade sandwiches, his clean, but for a laptop and business magazines. Michael told stories like sales pitches. "I can see the skyline," he said once, tracing invisible towers in the air. "Hayes Construction. The city arrives wearing my suit." Elizabeth countered with a gentler vision. "Stable lending," she murmured. "Transparent fees. A place where no doesn't sound like you are nothing." He laughed, not unkindly. "You're a good soul, Beth." She decided she liked the nickname from his mouth. Their friends noticed first. Sophie, her ferociously loyal roommate with a messy bun and black eyeliner, nudged her. "Mind the orbit," she warned. "Stars are lovely, but gravity can be cruel." Michael's best friend David, quieter, kept his distance, offering Elizabeth friendly nods that felt like small, folded warnings. Dates were modest. Shared chips on a bench, lectures smuggled into asides. Sometimes he drove her home in his second-hand but polished car, saying, "One day it'll be Italian." She collected his dreams like postcards she couldn't afford to send. "You make everything seem possible," he told her, cupping her face, and somewhere in her chest a lighthouse flared. She typed up his essays when he fell asleep on spreadsheets, brewed coffee he forgot to drink, and learned the slant of his ambition, the way sailors learn currents. "You believe in me," he said on a night wind tasted of rain. "I do," she whispered, believing that belief was the most precious thing she could give. She did not yet know the cost. Elizabeth's scholarship covered tuition, not living. She worked evening shifts at a cafe whose espresso machine wheezed like an aged tenor. She counted tips in the back room with ink-stained fingers, promising herself they were stepping stones and not anchors. "You okay?" Sophie asked, sliding in with her storm-colored scarf. "You look like you're arguing with arithmetic." Elizabeth smiled. "Just learning how to sleep less," she joked. "Heroic," Sophie deadpanned, "but heroes burn." Meanwhile, Michael rehearsed pitches to small investors, pacing grand arcs across tiny rooms. "Imagine a skyline born from courage," he'd say to Elizabeth, breathless. "Imagine my name, our name, up there." The hour made her forgive the selfish hours, the missed calls, the way he forgot to ask about her exams. She fed his dream with time she couldn't spare. "I'll format the deck," she said. "Just send the notes." When he slept, she rearranged his slides, trimmed his metaphors, softened his bravado just enough to sound brilliant, not brash. "You should bill me," he teased. "Pay me in belief," she replied, only half joking. "Done." He kissed her forehead. "I'll make you proud." She already was, or wanted to be. At the shop, George pretended not to notice the purple crescents under her eyes. "Study first, sweep later," he ordered. Helena pressed a pasty into Elizabeth's hand. "You can't pour from an empty kettle," she said softly. Elizabeth smiled, promised to rest, and learned to lie kindly. The call came between closing the till and locking the door. George had collapsed in the stockroom, his breath a thin elastic snapping and catching. The shop smelled of onions and fear. Helena's hands shook hard enough that keys chimed. "Hospital," Elizabeth said, steady in the way people are when steadiness is the only available bridge. In the emergency ward, the fluorescent light peeled tenderness from the air. Machines blinked in indifferent rhythm. "Your father had a stroke," the doctor explained, gentle but rushed. "The next 24 hours matter." Helena's mouth formed a prayer that wouldn't leave. Elizabeth held her mother's shoulders as if her grip alone kept the woman from breaking into 100 small, sharp pieces. They were handed a list, tests, scans, a medication schedule, each item ticking like a metronome above a ledger. The cost was not catastrophic on paper, but paper didn't know how empty their pockets were after a soft winter. "I'll sort it," Elizabeth said. "How?" Helena whispered. "We will," Elizabeth corrected, though the "we" hung on her like armor 2 sizes too big. She left for the corridor and called Sophie. "I'll help," Sophie said without waiting for details. "I'll call David, too." Elizabeth hesitated, thumb hovering over Michael's name. Pride wrestled with need. Need exhausted, won. She pressed call and counted the rings like coins. He answered on the 5th ring, city noise curtaining his voice. "Beth, can I call back? I'm at a bar with." "Michael, please," she cut in, her voice shaking. "Dad had a stroke. He needs a prescription tonight. I need £100 I can pay you back by Friday." There was a pause. Laughter flared behind him. "100!" he repeated, as if tasting the smallness. "Beth, if you can't manage 100. "It's not about managing," she said, humiliation rising like heat. "It's timing, please," he sighed. "You've got to learn to stand on your own. I can't build an empire dragging. All this." The word "this" scattered her into invisible pieces. "Michael," she whispered, "this is my father." The line went sharper, colder. "I'm sorry about George, truly, but I can't always be your safety net. You want to be strong. Start now." Silence filled the gap. In the background, someone asked him to toast. He covered the speaker, then returned with a smoothened voice. "I'll call you tomorrow, okay?" "Tomorrow is too late," she said, and in that sliver of time something precious finished breaking. They didn't hear it or chose not to. "Be strong, Beth." The click was quieter than any gunshot, and somehow louder. Sophie found Elizabeth outside the hospital, shoulders knotted like rope. "No," Sophie asked. Elizabeth shook her head. They said strength. Sophie swore creatively and took her hand. Together they found the money, Sophie's savings, a neighbor's kindness, the pharmacist's mercy. When Elizabeth returned to the ward, the drip sang its indifferent song. She sat, awake beside her father, and learned the shape of a new kind of night. George died at dawn, as if he didn't want to burden the day with his leaving. Helena's cry sounded like a cupboard door slammed in an empty house. Elizabeth held her mother and thought of all the small debts kindness had paid for, all the laters written in careful script. The funeral was simple and full. Mrs. Doyle brought a dish and tears. David stood in the back, his grief awkward, his loyalty clean. Sophie stayed pressed to Elizabeth's side like a lighthouse unwilling to dim. Michael arrived late tie immaculate, eyes dry. He hugged Elizabeth, light and careful, like someone embracing smoke. "I'm sorry," he said. "I meant to come sooner." She nodded, because there were no words generous enough to cover a grave. After the wake, he reached for her hand. "You know I love you," he said, as if love were a voucher that could silence all receipts. "You know I'm under pressure. Investors, timelines. I said things, to push you to stand on your own." She stared at their reflection in the shop window, two shapes blurred by breath. "I stood last night," she answered, voice dull with sleeplessness. "Without you." He flinched. "Don't make this dramatic." She pulled her hand away. "No," she said softly. "I'm making it accurate." The next day, she placed his letters in a shoebox, shut the lid, and learned the art of leaving without slamming a single door. He told friends she'd be back. She did not correct him. She was busy surviving. The finance office smelled of toner and impatience. Elizabeth's desk wobbled. Her chair mourned when she sat. Mr. Graham, her supervisor, wore suits like threats and cologne like confession. "You're green," he announced on her first day, tapping her resume with a pen that clicked like a metronome. "Green people make mistakes. Mistakes are expensive. Don't be expensive." She swallowed and nodded. "Yes, Mr. Graham," he taught by humiliation. "You call this a memo?" he barked once, waving a page like surrender. "If you were a client, would you trust a bank that writes like this?" She rewrote until words thinned into bone. At lunch, she chewed in the stairwell with Sophie on the phone. "He's a tyrant," Sophie said. "He's a mirror," Elizabeth replied. "I'm learning my angles." She watched everything, the way colleagues smoothed fear with jargon, how clients flinched when asked for proof of poverty, how a no could be clean or cruel depending on the mouth that carried it. At closing, she stayed to refile applications so they looked like respect, not rubble. Once Mr. Graham paused. "You tidy for show?" he grunted. "For order," she said. He snorted, but his voice softened by a hair. "People like you burn out." "Not if I learn fast," she answered. Nights, she studied at the kitchen table with Helena dozing nearby, glasses askew, grief breathing quietly between them. When she passed her first certification exam, she put the paper on George's empty chair and whispered, "We're not done." Professor Leonard's evening lectures were less about formulas than about consequences. "Interest," he told the class, "can be scaffold or snare. Decide which your work will be." His silver hair made him look like consequence personified. After class, Elizabeth waited as the room emptied. "Professor," she said, holding out a draft paper, "I want to design a small loan protocol that never sounds like accusation." He read line by line until the clock coughed past 9. "You have a spine for justice," he said at last, "and a head for calculus. That combination is rarer than you think." She flushed. "I have a mother who runs on dignity," she replied. Leonard smiled. "Bring her for tea," he said. "We'll talk about markets and mercy." Sophie celebrated Elizabeth's passing grades with toast at midnight and promises of louder celebrations when the budget agreed. David began sending her articles about ethical lending, then drafts of pro bono policies. "Your notes fix my sentences," he texted once. "Your sentences fix my courage," she replied. In the office, even Mr. Graham's scorn sharpened her. She learned to say declined without saying less. She learned to ask better questions. She learned to listen for the stories you can't capture in a field marked other. One evening, Leonard slid a notebook across the cafe table. "Build it," he said, "your model. Make it small first, but make it real." She held the empty pages like a door she had finally found the key for. It began with a baker named Noor, who needed 80 pounds to replace a mixer. The form called for guarantees Noor did not have, proof she could not print. Elizabeth sat across from her in the tiny bakery that smelled like warm sugar and courage. "Tell me your morning," Elizabeth said. Noor explained the dawn batches, the school orders, the 8 hands she paid fair wages, because she remembered her own first paycheck like a blessing. Elizabeth added figures, but she also wrote Noor's name as if it were a promise. "We can try a community-backed note," she suggested carefully. Noor blinked tears. "Will they laugh?" Elizabeth shook her head. "Not while I'm holding the pen." She took Noor's file to Mr. Graham. "No collateral," he noted, expression already tilted toward no. "Performance collateral," Elizabeth countered. "Weekly repayments tied to revenue receipts, a cap on penalties, automatic restructuring after any hospital stay. We write the risk down by writing the human up." He stared, surprised by her audacity. "If it fails, it's on you." "It won't," she said, feeling George's steady hand at her back. Noor's mixer arrived 2 weeks later. The first repayment came with cinnamon rolls and a shy, luminous smile. In the stairwell, Elizabeth pressed her forehead to the cool rail and let herself cry, quiet tears that tasted like something beginning. That night, she laid Leonard's notebook open on the table and wrote the first line, Carter Micro, Dignity First. Elizabeth's work in the small finance office began to earn recognition, not only from clients, but also from peers who admired her ability to balance numbers with compassion. She was still young, but her persistence made her stand apart from colleagues who often followed rules without question. One late afternoon, as she was carefully reviewing files, she overheard 2 coworkers whispering about Michael Hayes. They mentioned his new company, Hayes Construction, and how he had been making bold moves in the city's property market. Her heart stiffened when she realized he had gathered funding from the same investors he used to complain about, men who once dismissed his ideas. She wondered how he convinced them. Later that evening, she saw his face in the newspaper, a polished photo with the caption, Michael Hayes, the new voice of Manchester's future. He looked confident, radiant, and successful, as though the humiliation he had dealt her never existed. That night, Elizabeth lay awake, questioning how 2 people could have shared so much yet stood on such unequal ground now. The sting of his dismissal replayed in her mind, but rather than break her, it sharpened something unspoken within her. Days later, she encountered Michael by chance at a restaurant where she was meeting Sophie. He walked in with Vanessa Moore, a glamorous woman in a flowing red dress whose presence attracted stares from every corner. Michael spotted Elizabeth and approached her table. "Elizabeth," he said smoothly, "you're looking decent, still at that small office." The words were coated in casual cruelty, and Vanessa's laugh rang like glass breaking. Elizabeth swallowed, keeping her face composed. "Yes, Michael," she replied, her tone steady. "Still at that small office, but small things grow." He leaned down and whispered, "Not fast enough to catch up to me." Sophie's hand tightened around Elizabeth's under the table, silently reminding her to hold her ground. Vanessa tugged Michael's arm impatiently, and he left with the air of a man who thought he had won twice. That evening, Elizabeth told Sophie, "One day he'll see me, not as the girl begging for £100, but as someone he cannot reach." Her voice carried no bitterness, only a quiet vow. Elizabeth's job grew harder as more clients sought help in desperate situations. Every file carried stories of families crushed by interest rates and small shop owners drowning under dishonest contracts. One afternoon, she met Mr. Patel, a graying man who needed a loan to keep his bookstore alive. His trembling hands betrayed years of struggle. "Banks shut their doors when I walk in," he admitted. "They see failure before I even speak." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "I see a man who values knowledge, and knowledge is an asset too," she said. When she defended his case to Mr. Graham, he nearly threw the file at her. "Do you think this is charity?" he barked. "This is finance. Your heart will ruin you." Elizabeth didn't flinch. "My heart will guide me to clients who will never forget fairness," she answered. That day, Mr. Patel received his loan, and though Graham sneered, he could not deny the repayment that came sooner than expected. Elizabeth realized then that she was no longer merely learning. She was quietly reshaping the system from within. At night, she discussed her dreams with Sophie and David. "The world doesn't need more banks," she told them as they sat in Sophie's flat with notebooks scattered across the table. "It needs places where dignity is preserved with every signature." David leaned forward. "You have vision, Elizabeth. Investors want numbers, but vision makes them believe." Sophie smirked. And you've got both. You just don't know how powerful that is yet. Elizabeth smiled faintly. She carried their words with her to class the next day, where Professor Leonard challenged her even more. You must calculate risk like an engineer, he told her, but never forget that every formula hides a face behind it. When you design your model, you're designing a life. His words sank deep, sparking the blueprint of a future she didn't dare speak aloud yet. What she did know was that she had begun to collect principles, mentors, and strength, pieces of armor she would one day wield. Years crept forward, marked by Elizabeth's growing reputation as someone who solved problems others ignored. Her name began to circulate in quiet circles where people spoke of hope instead of figures. She had saved families from eviction, given tailors second chances, and revived bakeries on the edge of collapse. These victories did not bring her wealth yet, but they built something sturdier. Trust. Helena often reminded her, money will follow character. Build the latter, and the former will chase you. Elizabeth clung to those words. Meanwhile, Michael's name became louder in the business community. Newspapers covered his new deals, and Vanessa's presence beside him made the image glitter even brighter. Elizabeth, however, no longer flinched when she saw him in print. Instead, she folded the paper and whispered to herself, "Let him rise. It only means his fall will echo further." One evening, as Elizabeth left the office, she found Michael waiting by her car. His suit was immaculate, his smile sharp. "Beth," he began, using the old nickname as though it still belonged to him. "We should catch up. I could use someone like you at Hayes Construction. You've always been supportive." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "Supportive?" she repeated. "You mean invisible labor while you stood in the light?" Michael chuckled, brushing off her tone. "Don't be bitter. Come with me, and you'll never have to think about money again." For a moment, her heart stuttered at the echo of their past, but then she steadied herself. "I don't want your empire, Michael," she said firmly. "I'm building mine," he scoffed. "You, a clerk in a cubicle." She opened her car door, meeting his gaze. "Yes, me. Watch carefully, because you'll remember this conversation one day." He laughed and waved her off, but something in her calm shook him more than anger ever could. Elizabeth began Carter Micro with little more than conviction and a handful of savings. The first office was no larger than her old bedroom, furnished with a desk David found at an auction and 2 chairs Sophie painted to look new. The sign on the door was handwritten, the ink smudged from her trembling hand. Yet when the first clients walked in, she straightened her shoulders and spoke with the authority she had earned through scars. "We don't measure you by what you lack," she told a seamstress in tears. "We measure you by what you can build." Word spread quickly, not through billboards, but through whispers of dignity restored. People who had once hidden from banks now knocked on Elizabeth's modest door, seeking fairness. It was not easy. Money was tight, and sometimes she lay awake wondering if she had been reckless to leave stability. Sophie managed the files with fierce precision, while David crafted policies that balanced risk with humanity. "We're small," he said once, "but we're honest. That's rarer than people think." Elizabeth poured herself into the work, guiding every loan personally, learning from mistakes, and refusing to let a single client feel lesser than the papers they signed. One evening, Helena visited the office, touching the smudged sign with trembling fingers. "Your father would have stood here all night, proud," she whispered. Elizabeth closed her eyes and felt the weight of his unseen blessing. It was not wealth yet, but it was foundation. Brick by brick, breath by breath, the outline of something formidable was rising. 3 years after Carter Micro opened its doors, Elizabeth attended her first business forum. She wore a navy suit borrowed from Sophie and carried documents bound with trembling hands. The hall was filled with towering names, their laughter polished and loud. When she stepped onto the stage to present her model of dignified lending, whispers rose. "Who is she?" "She's young. She's untested." But Elizabeth spoke with clarity born from scars. "A loan is not charity," she declared. "It is a bridge, and a bridge must never shame the one who crosses it." The audience grew silent. Her numbers were modest compared to giants, but her conviction held the room. By the end, a few small investors approached her, intrigued by her approach. It was the first crack of recognition, and it lit something fierce in her heart. That evening, as she stood outside the hall, she heard a familiar voice behind her. Michael. He was there with Vanessa on his arm, glowing in diamonds. "Elizabeth Carter," he drawled. "Still chasing crumbs, I see. Impressive speech, though. Naive." Vanessa laughed lightly, as though his words were gospel. Elizabeth met his gaze, her posture unshaken. "Naive enough to believe people deserve respect," she said. He smirked. "Respect doesn't build towers." "Neither does arrogance," she replied calmly. For the first time, a flicker of unease passed over his face before he masked it. She walked away, shoulders squared, her heart pounding not with fear, but with quiet triumph. She did not yet know it, but her name had entered a world that would one day need her more than she could ever imagine. Elizabeth's name began to travel beyond whispers. Local newspapers started covering Carter Micro's impact on small businesses. One article featured Noor, the baker whose shop now employed twice as many workers. "She didn't just give me money," Noor told the reporter. "She gave me dignity." Soon, struggling traders, widows, and artisans flooded her modest office, carrying with them dreams they thought the city had buried. Elizabeth sat with each of them, listening more than she spoke, scribbling notes in her worn ledger. Helena, who often brought meals to the office, would smile softly. "You remind me of your father, Liz," she whispered. "He gave more than he ever had, and so do you." One afternoon, Elizabeth received an invitation to a larger financial conference in London. Sophie grinned as she opened the envelope. "They're finally seeing what we've seen all along," she said. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she traced the gold letters of her name. When she arrived at the conference, she was not given the grand stage but a side panel with emerging entrepreneurs. Still, she spoke with fire. "If finance doesn't heal, then it wounds," she told the small audience. Afterward, a gentleman named Mr. Bennett, a wealthy but discreet investor, approached her. "Your model is raw but revolutionary," he said. "I'll back you, not because you have numbers yet, but because you have integrity. That's the only asset that compounds without collapse." That night, Elizabeth realized her life was pivoting. The tide that once dragged her down had begun to carry her forward. With Bennett's investment, Carter Micro moved from its cramped office into a small but modern building in the heart of Manchester. Sophie oversaw the move with military precision, while David managed contracts with care. "We're not just changing offices," Elizabeth told them on the first morning, standing in the empty boardroom. "We're changing how people view us. This is no longer a corner operation. We're a bank in the making." They all clapped, but Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears at how far they had come. The expansion brought challenges, longer hours, complex loans, and stricter regulations, but Elizabeth thrived under the weight. She visited clients personally, from dock workers to seamstresses, learning their struggles firsthand. "Numbers are important," she told her staff, "but stories are what remind us why numbers matter." At home, Helena watched her daughter rise with pride, though she often warned, "Don't let the city's lights blind you, Liz. Stay rooted." One evening, Elizabeth gathered her small team and said, "We are going to rebrand. From today, we'll be Carter Finance." The name carried not just her identity, but her father's legacy. David leaned across the table and whispered, "One day, it will be Carter Global." Elizabeth laughed quietly, unaware of how prophetic his words would become. Elizabeth's rising star did not go unnoticed. Competitors who once dismissed her now saw her as a threat. At a high-profile investors' dinner, she was seated across from Michael and Vanessa. The glittering chandelier above them cast long shadows, and the tension at the table was palpable. Michael leaned forward, his smile sharp. "So, Elizabeth, they say you're building a bank out of scraps. Impressive. But don't you think you're playing in a league too big for you?" Vanessa smirked, sipping her wine. Elizabeth placed her fork down gently. "Scraps build mosaics, Michael, and mosaics last centuries while towers fall." The table fell silent for a beat, then erupted in polite laughter, though Elizabeth saw the flicker of anger in his eyes. Later that evening, as she stepped into the hallway, Michael cornered her. "You think you've changed, Beth," he whispered harshly, "but you'll always be the girl begging me for £100. Elizabeth stared at him, her voice calm. "That girl is gone, and the man who denied her is losing pieces of himself every day. Michael's face hardened, but before he could reply, Sophie appeared at her side. "Ready to leave?" she asked, sliding her arm through Elizabeth's. As they walked away, Elizabeth whispered, "He still underestimates me." Sophie squeezed her hand. "Good. Let him. That will be his downfall." 2 years later, Carter Finance was no longer small. Offices opened in Birmingham, Liverpool, and Leeds, each branch echoing Elizabeth's philosophy of dignity-driven lending. International investors began taking notice, and whispers of a new kind of bank spread beyond the UK. At a board meeting, David stood up and announced, "It's time we stopped calling ourselves Carter Finance. Our reach is global. Let us become Carter Global Bank." The room broke into applause, but Elizabeth sat quietly, overwhelmed. Sophie leaned toward her. "This is your father's name on every door, every wall, every loan. It's his shop reborn." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes as she nodded. "Then let's make it official." The rebranding ceremony was grander than anything Elizabeth could have imagined. Reporters swarmed the hall, and cameras flashed as she unveiled the new logo. "Carter Global Bank," she declared. "A bank for people, not profits. A place where stories matter." The hall erupted in cheers, and Elizabeth felt a surge of triumph. Yet even as she stood in the glow of success, she caught sight of Michael in the crowd. His expression was unreadable, but she knew envy burned behind it. He whispered something to Vanessa before storming out. Elizabeth didn't falter. She knew the battle between them was only beginning, and this time she had the power of an empire behind her. Michael Hayes's empire, built on bold deals and borrowed trust, began to show cracks. Investors whispered of failed projects, lawsuits loomed, and contractors abandoned sites midway. Vanessa, once the shimmering jewel at his side, grew restless with his faltering grip on wealth. One night, Elizabeth received a call from a journalist friend. "Michael's in trouble," he said. "Massive debts, shady deals exposed. He may come to you." Elizabeth's hand tightened around the phone. "If he does, he'll find I am not the girl he left behind." Meanwhile, within her own empire, Elizabeth doubled her efforts to protect Carter Global from outside threats. She tightened policies, expanded her advisory board, and ensured transparency in every contract. Helena watched proudly but reminded her, "Power is like fire, it can warm or burn. Guard it carefully." Elizabeth nodded, carrying the weight of her mother's wisdom. At a charity gala, whispers reached her ears that Michael was desperately seeking loans from rivals, each rejection cutting deeper. Sophie leaned close. "He's drowning, Liz, and he may try to grab onto you." Elizabeth lifted her glass, her gaze steady across the glittering hall. "Let him try," she replied. "This time, I hold the waters." It was a gray Monday morning when Elizabeth's secretary entered her office with an odd expression. "Miss Carter," she said quietly, "there's someone here insisting to see you. He says it's urgent." Elizabeth looked up from the stack of files she was reviewing, her pen frozen in her hand. When the door opened, Michael Hayes walked in. His once polished suit was creased, his face weary, and the pride that had once lit his every word seemed fractured. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice strained, "I need your help." For a moment, silence filled the air, thick with memories. Elizabeth closed her folder slowly. "What kind of help?" she asked calmly, though her heart remained steady as stone. He swallowed, his arrogance cracked by desperation. "A loan to keep Hayes Construction afloat. Without it, everything collapses. I'll lose everything." Elizabeth studied him, her gaze piercing. "You once told me weakness doesn't build empires," she reminded him. He winced, lowering his eyes. "I was wrong," he whispered. "I was arrogant. Please, Elizabeth, I have employees who depend on me, a reputation to uphold, and debts that could destroy me." Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, fingers clasped together. "And you've come to me, of all people?" she asked. Michael nodded slowly, shame radiating from every word. "Yes, because I know you have what it takes. I know you're the only one who can help me now." Sophie, who had been silently observing from the corner, muttered, "Poetic, isn't it?" Elizabeth silenced her with a glance, but kept her eyes on Michael. Inside her, old wounds ached, but her power reminded her she was no longer the girl begging in the dark. Elizabeth did not give him an answer that day. Instead, she called an emergency board meeting, summoning Sophie, David, and her senior advisors. The air in the room was heavy with curiosity when she explained, "Michael Hayes has approached us for a loan." Gasps echoed, followed by murmurs. David leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "That man once belittled you, Elizabeth. Now he comes crawling. What do you intend to do?" Elizabeth's face was calm. "We must deliberate. Personal history cannot blind us, but neither should it dictate mercy." Sophie shook her head sharply. "History isn't personal when it's public humiliation. He denied you dignity when you needed it most. You owe him nothing." Elizabeth glanced at her, steady. "And yet, what we choose now defines who we are as a bank." The debate grew intense. Some board members argued that Hayes Construction, despite its failings, could still be a strategic ally if rescued. Others insisted it was too great a risk. Finally, Elizabeth raised her hand. "Enough. We will hear his case formally, with transparency, before the board. If he deserves rejection, it will not come from bitterness, but from principle." Her voice was resolute, echoing through the glass walls. The decision was made. Michael would present his appeal in a hearing. Sophie later approached Elizabeth privately. "Why give him the dignity he never gave you?" Elizabeth answered softly, "Because dignity is mine to give. And because his fall will mean more when witnessed by the world." The day of the hearing arrived with unusual buzz. Elizabeth had arranged for the meeting to be observed by select journalists, disguised as independent auditors. "Let the truth be public," she instructed her assistant. Michael entered the boardroom in a tailored suit that could not mask his frayed edges. His voice wavered as he presented his plea. "Carter Global is my last hope," he confessed, his eyes darting nervously across the faces of the board members. "I have employees who will lose their jobs if I fail, families who depend on me. Give me this loan and I'll rebuild." His words were practiced, but the desperation beneath them was raw. Elizabeth listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When Michael turned toward her directly, his voice cracked. "Elizabeth, I know I wronged you. I know I turned my back when you needed me. I was blind. Please don't do the same to me, please." The room was silent except for the sound of cameras clicking softly from behind the tinted glass. Sophie leaned in, whispering, "He's begging now. Just like you once begged." Elizabeth's eyes remained on Michael. "We will deliberate," she said firmly. "You will have your answer shortly." Michael bowed his head, his pride in shambles. He did not see the reporters scribbling furiously, capturing every detail of his humiliation. When the board reconvened, Elizabeth returned to the head of the table, carrying her leather-bound folder. She opened it slowly, each movement deliberate. Michael looked at her with hope clinging desperately to his face. Elizabeth's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Michael, years ago I asked you for £100 to save my father's life. You laughed and told me weakness doesn't build empires. That night, I buried not only my father, but also the part of me that believed you cared." His shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. The room was silent. Then she reached into her folder and pulled out a crisp £100 note, sliding it across the table toward him. "Here is what you denied me," she said softly. "Let's call it even." Michael's eyes widened, his breath caught in his throat. For a moment he stared at the bill, then at her, realizing the depth of the humiliation. Elizabeth lifted the stamp in her hand and brought it down on the loan file. The sound, "denied," echoed through the boardroom like thunder. Michael flinched, his last thread of pride snapping. At that very moment, the hidden journalists stepped forward, cameras flashing, pens scratching. The story of his downfall was captured for the world. He stumbled, trying to speak, but the weight of his collapse silenced him. Elizabeth rose to her feet. "This meeting is adjourned," she declared, her voice unshakable. She walked out flanked by Sophie and David, leaving Michael to drown in the ruins of his own arrogance. The following morning, newspapers across the country carried the story. Elizabeth Carter denies Michael Hayes loan, £100 returned after years of betrayal. Photographs of the boardroom moment dominated headlines, showing Elizabeth poised and powerful while Michael sat broken. Social media erupted with commentary. Some hailed Elizabeth as a symbol of justice, a woman who turned humiliation into triumph. Others debated whether she had been too harsh, but all agreed she had become a figure impossible to ignore. Helena, reading the paper at her kitchen table, wiped tears from her eyes. "Your father would have smiled today," she whispered, placing the newspaper against his old photograph. Meanwhile, Michael's empire crumbled faster than anyone had predicted. Investors pulled out, partners severed ties, and Vanessa disappeared from his life without a trace. He was left isolated, haunted by the echo of Elizabeth's words and the sight of that 100-pound bill. Elizabeth, however, did not revel in his misery. Instead, she returned to her work, expanding Carter Global Bank with renewed vigor. In a private conversation with Sophie, she admitted, "I didn't do it to destroy him. I did it to remind myself and the world that dignity is priceless." Sophie smiled proudly. "And you've shown them all what true strength looks like." Elizabeth nodded, the fire in her heart steady. She had carried pain for years, but now she carried power, and the world watched as she walked into her destiny. Elizabeth's phone would not stop buzzing. Calls, emails, and invitations poured in from journalists, international investors, and even political figures who wanted to be associated with her story. "They're calling you the woman who rewrote finance with compassion," Sophie said one evening, scrolling through article after article on her tablet. David added, "The irony is that your act of refusal has opened more doors than any loan you've ever approved." Elizabeth listened quietly, her mind torn between gratitude and caution. "Publicity is a tide," she replied. "It lifts, but it can also drown. We must move carefully." Despite her humility, she knew the world now looked at her differently. She was no longer just Elizabeth Carter, the daughter of shopkeepers. She had become a symbol of resilience and power. That week, she accepted an interview on national television. Seated under bright studio lights, the host asked, "Do you regret denying Michael Hayes?" Elizabeth met the camera with calm eyes. "I do not regret choosing principle over pity," she said. "Banks should not be places where dignity is stripped. My decision was not revenge. It was alignment with values Carter Global Bank will always uphold." Across the nation, viewers leaned closer to their screens, moved by her composure. Helena watched from her armchair at home, clutching her rosary. "You've made pain into a sermon, Liz," she whispered to the empty room, knowing George would have nodded beside her. While Elizabeth's name soared, Michael sank deeper into shadows. Once acclaimed contractors refused to answer his calls, creditors froze his accounts, and his offices, once bustling, now stood half empty. His reflection in the mirror frightened him, creased forehead, hollow eyes, a man who had once mocked weakness, now brought to his knees by it. He visited old friends, begging for support, but most turned away. One evening, drunk and disheveled, he staggered into a pub where David happened to be dining. Spotting him, Michael lurched toward the table. "David," he muttered, "you know me." "Talk to her. Convince Elizabeth to reconsider." David stared at him, his voice measured. "Michael, she doesn't need to reconsider. You do. Pride built your empire, and pride is what tore it down." Michael's jaw tightened, but his silence was heavier than words. The following week, he wrote Elizabeth a letter, his handwriting shaky, stained by watermarks that might have been tears. "Elizabeth," it read, "you have become everything I once dreamed of, but was too blind to appreciate. I don't ask for pity anymore. I only ask that you remember I am still human beneath the ruin." When Elizabeth read it, she set it down carefully. Sophie asked, "Will you answer?" Elizabeth shook her head slowly. Not every cry deserves a reply. Some answers are written in silence. Still, a small ache lingered in her chest, not for Michael, but for the tragedy of wasted ambition. Elizabeth's growing reputation earned her an invitation to the Global Financial Summit in Geneva. Leaders of the world's largest banks, government officials, and philanthropists would attend. David insisted, "This is your moment to show Carter Global is not just a British success, but a global force." Sophie adjusted her glasses and added, "But remember, Liz, they'll challenge you. They'll test if compassion can stand against profit-driven giants." Elizabeth nodded, her nerves hidden behind her steady gaze. "Then let them test. I have nothing to fear." The summit hall was grand, its chandeliers reflecting centuries of power. Elizabeth stepped onto the stage, her navy dress simple yet commanding. The audience expected statistics, but she began with a story, the story of her father's shop, of the night she begged for help, of the cost of humiliation. Finance, she concluded, is not numbers. It is lives. The hall erupted in applause, and afterward, she was approached by global investors eager to partner with her bank. Yet what moved her most was a quiet moment outside the hall, where a young woman in a waitress uniform whispered, "Thank you for saying we matter." Elizabeth smiled, touched more deeply by those words than by the handshakes of billionaires. That night, as she overlooked Lake Geneva, Sophie asked, "Do you realize you've become the voice of millions?" Elizabeth replied softly, "I realize I've become my father's daughter on a larger stage." Returning from Geneva, Elizabeth found herself haunted by the thought of choices. She thought of every client who had once sat trembling before her desk, every yes and every no that had shaped their lives. One evening, while working late in her office, she heard a knock. To her surprise, it was Vanessa Moore. Vanessa looked older, the glamour worn thin, her eyes weary. "Elizabeth," she said cautiously, "I came not to ask for anything but to warn you. Michael is not himself. He blames you for his ruin." Elizabeth frowned. "He ruined himself," she answered. Vanessa nodded weakly. "But in his mind, you were the final blow. Watch yourself." For a moment, the two women, once rivals, stood in uneasy solidarity. Vanessa left quietly, and Elizabeth sat alone in the boardroom, staring at her reflection in the glass. Sophie entered moments later, sensing her unease. "What did she want?" she asked. Elizabeth sighed, a warning. That Michael's bitterness may be sharper than his regret. Sophie placed a hand on her shoulder. "Bitterness is powerless against what you've built. Don't let ghosts rattle you." Elizabeth nodded, but her thoughts lingered on Michael, not in fear, but in a strange, distant pity. She knew she had chosen differently at every crossroads, and that was what separated them. Choices that built bridges instead of walls. Choices that preserved dignity instead of shredding it. Months later, Elizabeth stood on the balcony of Carter Global's new skyscraper headquarters. Below her, the city stretched in lights, a living testament to every struggle she had endured. Sophie joined her, handing her a folder of new international contracts. "We've come far," she said, her voice filled with pride. Elizabeth nodded. "Farther than I once dared to dream." Just then, news arrived that Michael Hayes had filed for bankruptcy. The announcement was splashed across the evening bulletins, his empire officially dissolved. Elizabeth stared at the headline for a moment, then folded the paper without a word. The following week, she hosted a press event to announce Carter Global's expansion into Africa and Asia. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions. One asked, "Do you have any words for Michael Hayes, now that his empire has collapsed?" Elizabeth paused, her eyes calm, her voice steady. "No," she said simply. "My words are for those who still believe their dreams can rise from nothing." The hall erupted in applause. As she left the stage, Helena's frail voice echoed in her memory. "Dignity first." Elizabeth smiled quietly. She had carried humiliation, borne rejection, and faced betrayal, but now she walked with unshakable dignity, the world watching as she wrote history with every step. And behind her, the shadow of Michael Hayes faded into silence, a cautionary tale eclipsed by the brilliance of her destiny. Here's the Bible verse for the story. "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Psalm 118, verses 22 to 23 NIV. This verse reflects Elizabeth's journey, once mocked, overlooked, and humiliated, yet later becoming the foundation of something far greater. Moral of the story: life often tests us through rejection, humiliation, and betrayal, but true strength is found in how we rise from those ashes. Elizabeth's story teaches that dignity, resilience, and faith in one's values can transform the deepest wounds into stepping stones toward greatness. The same doors that close in your face today may one day open under your authority. Never measure your worth by someone else's opinion. Your destiny is written in perseverance, not in the hands of those who doubt you. Closing prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the story of Elizabeth, a reminder that though we may be rejected, humiliated, and overlooked by men, you never forget our worth. Lord, we pray for the strength to endure trials with dignity, to carry rejection as a seed of growth, and to rise from pain with faith and courage. Teach us to never repay evil with evil, but to let our lives be testimonies of your grace. Help us to walk in integrity even when others wrong us, to trust your timing when doors are closed, and to remember that you alone are the author of our destiny. Lord, when prideful voices mock us, let us hear your voice louder. When betrayal wounds us, let your love be our healing. And when success comes, may we use it not for vengeance, but for purpose, to build, to bless, and to uplift others. May our lives, like Elizabeth's, reflect resilience, compassion, and dignity, so that even in our triumphs, the glory belongs to you alone. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.